The land office clerk was turning his key in the lock when 3 riders came out of the dusk and told him to open it again. Hester Graves stood just inside the door with her own paper still wet with ink, and she watched Abel Whitlock's hand freeze on the bolt. Through the window glass, painted with the gold letters RIOGRAND County Land Office, she could see the men clearly enough in the last violet light. 3 horses blowing steam into the cold evening air, 3 rifles resting easy across 3 saddle bows, and in front, a broad man with a flat black hat and a scar through one eyebrow who she did not know by face but had heard named more than once at the feed store. Cyrus Bell. "Evening, Whitlock," Bell said, and his voice came muffled but clear enough through the door. "We need a look at today's entry book. Won't take but a minute." "Office is closed," Whitlock said, though his voice cracked on the second word. "Come back at 8 tomorrow, same as anybody. We're not asking twice." Hester's mouth had gone dry. She had come in at 2:30 that afternoon to file a contest against a water claim, and she had watched Joel McCrae sign the register 5 minutes ahead of her, his jaw tight, refusing to look at her the whole while, because they had been arguing over that same spring since the previous autumn, and neither one of them had learned to be polite about it. She had signed under his name in the same book, same day, same page. She had not thought about it again until this moment, watching 3 armed men demand the very ledger her name sat inside. The door burst inward before Whitlock got the bolt thrown, and the clerk staggered back with his spectacles knocked askew. Bell came through first, and behind him a lean young man with a shotgun, and behind him a heavy-set one who smelled of whiskey and horse sweat even from across the room. Hester flattened herself against the shelf of surveyor's plats, holding her breath, and for one terrible second Bell's eyes swept past her without stopping, taking her for some rancher's wife come to file a claim, nothing more. "The book," Bell said, and Whitlock, hands shaking, reached beneath the counter and set the heavy ledger down. "Which page?" Bell said. "Today's," said the young one with the shotgun. "April 2nd, McCrae's filing." Hester's heart went cold and hard as a river stone. They wanted the very page with her own signature on it, the page that put Joel McCrae inside this office at 15 minutes past 2 that afternoon, the same hour, near as she had heard shouted in the street not an hour ago, that the Pagosa mail was robbed and Sam Petty shot dead on the Turkey Creek grade 40-some miles distant. A man could not ride 40 miles of mountain road in 2 hours. Not on his best horse, not on the devil's own. Whitlock turned the pages with fingers that would not quite obey him, and Bell reached across the counter and simply tore the page free before the clerk found it, the paper ripping loud in the quiet room. "That's county property," Whitlock said, high and thin. Bell backhanded him without any particular anger, the way a man swats a fly, and Whitlock went down against the shelf of deed boxes, and in the clatter and the falling papers, Hester did the only thing her body seemed willing to do. She snatched a second, older ledger from the shelf beside her, the one behind her hip that held March's entries, and held it against her skirts, and when the heavy-set man's eyes finally swung toward her, she was already moving for the back door as though she had every right to be leaving with a county record under her arm. "Hey," he said, "hold on now." She did not hold on. She went through the storeroom, past sacks of seed grain the county used for demonstration plots, and out into the alley where her horse, a rangy blue roan named Paloma, stood tied exactly where she had left her 2 hours before. She heard boots behind her, heard a voice call for her to stop in the name of something or other, and she swung up into the saddle the way her father had taught her, no wasted motion, and put her heels to the roan's ribs. A rifle cracked once behind her, and the ball went somewhere into the dark and did not come near her, and then she was around the corner of the livery, and out onto the wagon road with the wind cold in her face and her own heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She did not stop until she reached the split cottonwood 2 miles out, the one her father had always called the halfway tree, because it stood exactly halfway between town and the Graves place. There she reined in and sat gasping, the roan's sides heaving under her, and looked down at the ledger she had grabbed in her panic. It was the wrong one. Old entries, months gone, useless. She let out a breath that was half laugh and half sob and pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. The page with her name and Joel McCrae's name on it. The page that would have proved beyond any lawyer's argument that he could not have robbed that coach, was in Cyrus Bell's saddlebag now, torn loose and probably already burning in some fire pit behind the Voss ranch. But she had seen it. She had signed it herself in her own hand, not 6 hours past. 2:15 in the afternoon, Joel McCrae, homestead entry renewal, witnessed by Abel Whitlock. 2:20, Hester Graves, adverse claim filed same parcel, witnessed by the same man. She was, whether she liked it or not, the only living soul besides a half-conscious clerk who could swear to where Joel McCrae had been standing at the hour Sam Petty died. It took her until well past dark to work out what that meant, sitting the roan in the cold beneath a sky on the deep blue-black of a gun barrel, with frost already silvering the sage, though the day had been warm enough to work in shirt sleeves. This was the trick of the season, her father used to say. The land could not decide if it wanted to live or sleep, and so it did both in the same day, and a person had to be ready for either. She turned the roan back toward town, not toward home, not yet. Toward the sheriff's office, because whatever she felt about Joel McCrae and his stubborn claim on the spring water that ran along her southern fence line, she was not going to let an innocent man hang for want of her testimony, and she meant to say so before the night was any older. The sheriff of Rio Grande County was a heavy-set, unhurried man named Emmett Reyes, who had known Hester's father for 20 years and treated her mostly as though she were still the girl who used to ride into town on a pony too big for her. He listened to her account of the land office without once interrupting, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and rubbed at his mustache for a long moment. "You are telling me," he said finally, "that Joel McCrae was standing in Abel Whitlock's office at 2:15 this afternoon. I signed the book 5 minutes behind him. I saw him leave. I heard the clock in the hall strike the quarter hour while he was still arguing with me about the spring, and the coach was hit on Turkey Creek grade sometime before 4. Then he did not do it, Sheriff. He could not have, not unless he can fly." Reyes was quiet a moment. "There is a reward out already. Voss posted it not 2 hours after word came in. $200 for McCrae, dead or alive, on the strength of Bell's say-so that he found McCrae's rifle near the coach and that Petty named him with his dying breath." "That is a lie built on another lie," Hester said, "and you know it, or you would not be looking at me the way you are looking at me now." The sheriff sighed, an old man's sigh, though he was not yet 50. "I know Garrett Voss wants that stretch of grade land bad enough to eat it raw, on account of the railroad survey that's coming up through here inside 2 years. And I know he has been pushing to get the Ute right-of-way agreement thrown out on some claim they broke faith with the mail contract. I do not know that he had anything to do with Petty's death. I have no proof of it. All I have is a page torn out of my own land office ledger, and a dead deputy postal rider, and a manhunt already 3 hours old with half the able men in the county riding it for that $200. "Then let me ride it too," Hester said, before she had entirely decided to say it. Reyes looked at her properly then, the way he might look at a man. "You are the best tracker left in this county since your father passed, Hester Graves, and we both know it. If I deputize you, you ride under the law, not under Voss's bounty, and you bring McCrae in alive to stand before Judge Wardell when he rides circuit through here in 3 weeks' time. Alive, you understand me. Whatever proof you are carrying in your head about that ledger page does him no good at all if he's shot dead in some arroyo before he ever gets to speak it. I understand." And Hester, he held her eye. "Your note comes due at Colby's bank inside 6 weeks. I know that too. There is bounty money in this if you bring him in yourself instead of some fool who will just as soon shoot him for the reward. I am not going to pretend that isn't part of why you're sitting in that chair." She did not deny it. It was true enough. Her father's ranch, the only thing she had left of him besides his old cavalry saddle and his way of reading sign in dust and broken grass, would go to the bank inside 6 weeks if she could not find $240, and the note payment mattered to her every bit as much as justice did, and she was not ashamed to let the sheriff see both reasons sitting side by side in her. "I mean to bring him in," she said. "Whichever reason gets me there." Reyes swore her in with his hand on the county's own Bible, gave her a paper naming her a special deputy of Rio Grande County, and told her that word from the Turkey Creek relay put McCrae's trail heading east and then south, toward Pagosa Springs, and that Archuleta County's own sheriff had already been wired. She left town before midnight, riding by starlight and the memory of the road, because the trail would only get colder the longer she waited, and because some part of her, some part she did not examine too closely in that first hour, wanted very badly to be the one who found him first. The Turkey Creek grade climbed steadily out of the valley floor through stands of aspen just beginning to bud, pale green against the black spruce, and the going was slow enough in the dark that dawn found her still 4 miles short of the robbery site. She stopped only to rest the roan and to eat cold biscuit from her saddlebag, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge and began burning the frost off the sage, she had reached the place. It was easy enough to find. A dead man's blood had blackened the wagon ruts, and a scavenging magpie rose complaining from the brush at her approach. She dismounted and let the roan graze on its lead while she walked the ground the way her father had taught her, slow, eyes low, reading the story the earth was still willing to tell. The coach had come around the bend from the north, that much the ruts showed. It had stopped hard, both wheels locked, gouging twin furrows into the soft shoulder. She counted horse tracks in the churned dirt. 4 different animals, not one, all shod, all standing still for some minutes near the brush line as though their riders had waited there a good while before the coach ever came into view. A 5th set of tracks, unshod, came in later from the west and circled the scene twice before departing north again, and those were smaller, a mustang's tracks or a range pony's, nothing like the big-boned gelding Joel McCrae was known to ride. She crouched by the place where a body had clearly lain, marked by a wide dark stain and a scatter of dropped mail already gone soft with dew, and she felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning chill. 4 men waiting in ambush was not the work of one man alone robbing a coach on impulse. And nowhere in the churned dirt did she find a single track that matched the shoe pattern she remembered from Joel McCrae's gelding, a pattern she knew only because she had spent an unreasonable amount of time studying that horse's hoofprints along the disputed spring line, memorizing them the way a person memorizes an insult. She found, instead, a rifle lying half hidden in the buffalo brush 20 yards off, exactly where a man might toss a weapon he wanted found and did not want traced back to himself. She did not touch it. She only looked and noted the maker's stamp and rode on toward Pagosa Springs with a great deal more doubt in her chest than she had carried leaving Del Norte. The relay station outside Pagosa Springs was a low log building with a corral out back, and a woman named Adeline Innes running it with the help of one hired boy, her husband having died of the fever 2 winters past. She came out onto the porch at the sound of the roan's hooves, wiping her hands on her apron, and her face went guarded the moment Hester said Joel McCrae's name. "You're another bounty rider," Mrs. Innes said. "I've had 3 through here since yesterday noon, all of them looking to make $200 off a man's hide. I'm a deputy of Rio Grande County," Hester said, and showed her paper. "I am not looking to shoot him. I am looking to find out what happened because I do not believe he did what they say." Something in the older woman's shoulders eased. "Come inside, then. I've coffee on." Over 2 cups at the plank table, Mrs. Innes told her what she knew. Joel McCrae had ridden this route for 6 years, since he was 21, carrying mail and twice a season, the annuity payment the government owed the Ute band camped along the Pedra River under the old agreement, Gold coin wrapped and sealed, and never once come up short in all that time. Not a dollar of it, though plenty of men in this country would have called it easy money to steal. He is not a thief, Mrs. Innes said flatly. I have known that boy since he first rode this grade, half-starved and green as grass, and he has never once failed to deliver a letter or a payment on time, not in blizzard, not in flood. Last month he came through here in a state I'd never seen him in. Angry, worried sick, more like. Said something was wrong with the agreement paper, that the words written down for the county did not match what the interpreter had told the Ute Council, that somebody had cheated them out of grazing rights along the North Fork in the written copy that never got spoken aloud to them at all. Who told him this? He would not say entirely. Only that he meant to bring it before the land commissioner himself when the circuit judge came through, and that a certain party would not thank him for it. She set down her cup. 2 days after that, Sam Petty was dead and Joel was a wanted man. You tell me what that smells like, Miss Graves. Hester did not need to be told. It smelled exactly like Garrett Voss, wanting a piece of land bad enough to arrange a murder, and hang it around the neck of the one man who might have stood up in a courtroom and said the agreement had been falsified. She left the relay station with a fuller heart and a heavier certainty than she had ridden in with, and it was not 2 hours later, coming down through a stand of ponderosa above a dry wash, that she saw him. He was crouched at a small fire he had clearly built too carelessly for a hunted man, feeding twigs into it with the particular stubbornness of someone who had not slept properly in 2 days and no longer entirely cared who saw the smoke. His gelding stood picketed nearby, favoring its off foreleg. Hester drew rein above him on the ridge and simply watched for a long moment, her rifle across her saddle bow, trying to decide what kind of a man she was looking at. He was younger than she had somehow expected, though she knew perfectly well he was 6 years her senior, 28 to her 22, because they had argued about land records enough times that she knew half his history without ever asking for it. He had a lean, weathered face, sun-browned with several days of stubble darkening his jaw, and even hunted and half-starved there was an unhurried competence to the way he moved, checking his horse's hoof, testing the fire that reminded her uncomfortably of her own father. A twig snapped under Paloma's hoof, and his head came up fast, one hand already closing on the pistol at his hip. Hester called down and stood in her stirrups so he could see the badge Rays had pinned to her coat. I'm not here to shoot you, Joel McCrae, and if you draw that pistol on a deputized officer I will have no choice but to defend myself, which I would rather not do before breakfast. He did not lower the pistol, but he did not raise it either. Hester Graves, he said, and there was real astonishment in his voice. They sent you. I volunteered. For the $200 I expect. Partly, she said, because she had promised herself she would not lie to him, whatever else happened between them. And partly because I signed my name in Abel Whitlock's ledger not 5 minutes after you signed yours, and I know for a plain fact you could not have been on Turkey Creek grade when Sam Petty died, and I mean to see that fact stand up in front of a judge before some fool with a rifle decides it doesn't matter. He was quiet a long moment, studying her the way she had studied him. You believe me, he said finally, as though the words tasted strange in his mouth. I believe the ground I walked over this morning at that robbery site, which had 4 sets of shod tracks waiting in ambush, and not one hoofprint that matched your horse. I believe Adeline Innes, who says you never came up short $1 in 6 years riding annuity gold, and I believe a man does not usually murder his own partner and then build himself a fire in plain sight 2 days later like he hasn't got a worry left in the world. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone as quick as it came. I ran out of worry to spend on hiding. I have been trying to get back to Del Norte to speak to the judge myself. Only every relay station between here and there has 3 of Voss's riders sitting on the porch waiting for me, and my horse has gone lame on this last stretch, and I have started to think I would rather die telling the truth than live another week running from it. You are not going to die telling anybody anything, Hester said, more sharply than she meant to, and swung down off the roan. "Not while I am the one holding your fate in my saddlebag. Let me see that hoof." She led Paloma down into the wash and crouched by the gelding, running her hand down its foreleg the way her father had taught her, and found a stone bruise, ugly but not lasting, the kind that needed 3 days' rest to heal clean. Joel crouched opposite her, watching her hands work, and she was aware of him watching in a way that made her fingers clumsier than they ought to have been. "You know horses," he said. "My father was an army scout for 20 years before he ever homesteaded a spring. I learned to read a hoof before I learned to read a hymnal. I heard he passed last spring. I am sorry for it. He always dealt straight with me, even when we argued the water line." "He liked you," she said, surprised to find it was true and surprised further to find herself saying so. "Said you rode an honest road, whatever else you were too stubborn to admit about the boundary." Something passed between them then, some small unlooked-for warmth, quickly tamped down by the practical business of the moment, but Hester felt it settle in her chest like a coal banked for later. She told him, plainly, everything she had pieced together. The 4 sets of ambush tracks, the rifle planted in the brush, Adeline Inn's account of his warning about the falsified agreement, Cyrus Bell tearing the ledger page from Whitlock's book. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished he sat back on his heels and rubbed a hand over his face. "Then it is exactly what I feared," he said. "Voss means to have that grade land clear of any claim, ute or otherwise, before the railroad survey comes through, and he cannot do that if the true copy of the agreement ever reaches a judge's desk, and he cannot silence me quiet enough with just a bounty, so he made me a murderer instead. There is a true copy of the agreement. There was one read aloud to the Ute Council when it was signed 3 years back, promising them the North Fork grazing and trade for safe right-of-way through their land for the mail and the annuity delivery. What got filed at the county courthouse says something different. Says the grazing right is forfeit if the mail route is ever disrupted for cause, and somebody has been working hard to make it look disrupted. And I think Ezra Calloway, the interpreter who translated the council's answer that day, either sold his honesty to Voss or was made to swear to words he never truly heard spoken." "Then we need Calloway," Hester said, "or we need the Ute Council itself to say what was actually promised before either one, and we need it inside 3 weeks, before Judge Wardell rides circuit through Del Norte." Joel looked at her for a long moment in the cold morning light. The fire between them burned down to embers. "We," he said. "I'm not turning you loose to ride into that alone on a lame horse with half the county hunting your scalp for $200, Hester said. "Whatever else is true between us about that spring, I did not ride 2 counties in one night to hand you over to Cyrus Bell's rope. You are coming with me, and we are going to find that proof, and then we are going to walk into that courthouse together and let the record speak for itself. Courthouse records are the one thing in this territory that outlast a liar's convenience, Mr. McCrae, and I intend to make that fact work for us." He held out his hand across the dying fire, an oddly formal gesture between 2 people who had spent the better part of a year snapping at each other over a boundary line. "Joel," he said, "if we are going to ride together across 3 counties, you had better call me Joel." She took his hand. It was warm and calloused and steadier than she expected for a man who had spent 2 nights sleeping under sky with a bounty on his head. "Hester," she said, and did not let go quite as quickly as she meant to. They rested his gelding 2 full days in a hidden meadow above the wash, living on rabbit Hester snared and trout Joel took from the creek with a bent pin, and more patience than she had credited him with. And in those 2 days, something between them shifted the way spring ground shifts underfoot, imperceptibly and then all at once. She watched him work a splint of green willow around his gelding's tender foot, with a gentleness she had not expected from a man everyone in the county called a hard rider, murmuring to the animal the whole while as though it could understand comfort in words. He watched her set a snare with quick, sure fingers, and track a deer trail backward to find where a spring seeped up cold and sweet from beneath a granite shelf. And something in his face when he watched her work was not quite the wary calculation of a man watching his captor, and not quite anything either of them said aloud. At night the temperature dropped hard and fast, the way it did in that uncertain season, warm enough at noon to work bareheaded and cold enough by full dark to see their breath, and they sat close by necessity around the small fire he insisted on keeping low, and talked in the particular unguarded way of two people who had run out of reasons to keep their guard up. "Why do you ride the mail?" she asked him the second night, "instead of settling down proper on that claim you filed? You have held that homestead entry 3 years and never built more than a line shack on it." He was quiet a moment, turning a stick in the fire. "My folks died of the cholera when I was 9, back in Missouri. I was raised around by an aunt who did not much want the raising of me, and by the time I was 16, I had learned that the surest way to keep from being a burden on anybody was to be useful to everybody. A male rider is always useful. Somebody is always waiting on that road for a letter or a payment or word from a son gone west, and I found I liked being the man who never let them down. I filed on that spring 3 years back because I got tired, somewhere along the road, of never having a fire that was mine to build. But I never seemed to find the time to build more than a line shack, because there was always another route, another letter, another family waiting." "That is a lonely kind of useful," Hester said quietly. "I have thought that myself some nights." He looked at her across the fire. "Why do you fight so hard for that spring, if you don't mind my asking plain? Your father's main water comes off the river fork. That spring only waters 40 acres of hillside pasture." "It is not about the 40 acres, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "My father filed that contest the year before he died, because he said a man ought not be allowed to fence off a spring that fed 3 homesteads worth of deer and cattle both, just because he got his paper filed first. I kept fighting it after he passed because it was the last thing of his I had left unfinished, and because letting it go felt like letting him go a second time." Joel was quiet a long moment. "I did not know that," he said. "I only knew you fought me at every turn and never once explained why." "You never asked." "No," he agreed. "I suppose I did not." They rode out at first light on the third day, the gelding sound enough to bear weight again, following the old freight road south and west toward the Pedra River country, into La Plata County proper, where the Weemanutch band under a leader named Tovey had camped through the winter near the foot of the mountains. It was there, on the second afternoon of that ride, crossing a shoulder of open ground above the river, that Cyrus Bell's men found them. There were 3 of them this time, riding hard out of a stand of cedar with rifles already up, and the first shot took Joel's hat clean off his head before either of them had time to think. Hester's mare shied and she fought her down, and Joel had already wheeled his gelding into the cover of a rock outcrop, shouting for her to follow, and she did, heart slamming, bullets cracking off stone above them in a sound like the world's own anger. "2 of them flanking left," Joel called over the noise, calm in a way that steadied her more than any comfort could have. "Get down behind that boulder and hold your fire until they come past the deadfall. I'll draw the 3rd. She did not argue. She dropped from the saddle and scrambled behind the granite shelf with her rifle already at her shoulder, and watched Joel ride out from cover at a hard gallop, drawing 2 riders after him along the open shoulder of the hill, moving with a horsemanship that took her breath even in the middle of her own fear, low over the gelding's neck, weaving through scattered boulders like he had ridden that exact ground 100 times, because he likely had. 6 years of mail runs teaching a man every fold of this country. The 3rd rider came exactly where Joel had predicted, past the deadfall at a trot, rifle scanning the rocks, and Hester fired once, deliberately high, into the trunk of the dead pine 6 feet above his head. The shot cracked through the stillness and the horse reared, dumping its startled rider into the brush, and by the time he found his feet again, Hester had her rifle trained square on his chest. "Drop it," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands were less steady than she would have liked. "I am a deputized officer of Rio Grande County, and you are interfering with a lawful arrest." The man, young and clearly unused to being on the wrong end of a rifle, dropped his weapon. Joel came back 10 minutes later, his gelding blowing hard, having lost the other 2 riders in a stretch of broken country he knew and they did not. He looked at Hester's prisoner sitting sullen against the rock with his hands laced behind his head, and something like admiration broke across his tired face. "You held him alone." "I have been shooting rifles since I was 7 years old, Joel McCrae. You did not think I only knew how to read hoofprints." They tied the young rider's hands and left him for the Archuleta County Sheriff to collect, along with a note Hester wrote out plainly stating his part in an armed attack on a deputized officer, and rode on toward the river with the encounter settling into both of them. The shared danger, a kind of forge that had welded something between them tighter than either quite wanted to name yet. They reached the Ute camp along the Pedra the following afternoon, a scatter of lodges and canvas tents set along the cottonwood bottom, horses grazing on the first green shoots of the season, children running between the fires. Joel was known there, that much was plain from the way an older woman called his name, and came to take his horse's rein without being asked, and from the ease with which a group of young men greeted him, though their faces went guarded when they saw Hester riding beside him with a badge on her coat. Chief Tovey received them in front of his own lodge, a broad-shouldered man with gray threading his black hair, and a stillness to him that reminded Hester, oddly, of her own father in his last years, the stillness of a man who had buried more than he cared to speak of, and had learned patience as the only answer left to him. Beside him sat a younger man Joel introduced as Domingo Trujillo, a trader from the valley below who spoke Ute, Spanish, and English all with equal ease, and who Joel trusted, he said quietly to Hester, more than he trusted any government interpreter left in the territory. Through Trujillo, Joel laid out plainly what he suspected, that the paper filed at the Rio Grande County Courthouse did not match the words spoken and agreed to at this very fire 3 years past, and that a man wanted that mismatch to hold so that the North Fork grazing could be declared forfeit and open to the railroad survey. Tovey listened, his face giving away nothing, and when Trujillo finished translating, he spoke for a long while himself, his voice low and even, and Trujillo translated it in turn. "He says," Trujillo told them, "that his people have had many papers read to them over many years, and many of those papers said one thing aloud and meant another thing on the parchment, and that his father's father learned this lesson at Sand Creek and did not live to teach it twice. He says he agreed 3 years ago because the interpreter Calloway swore to him, in front of witnesses, that the North Fork grazing would remain there so long as the mail road stayed open and safe, and that he has kept his part of that bargain every season since, and that he does not understand why now, when nothing his people have done has changed, the ground beneath his feet is said to belong to someone else." "It has not changed," Hester said, and found her voice steadier than she expected, even with the weight of history sitting heavy in the circle around that fire. "A man wants your land for a railroad, and he has arranged for a lie to be written down where the truth was spoken aloud, and he has murdered an innocent postal rider, and tried to hang the blame on the one man who might have caught the lie in time. We have come to ask if any among your people still remember, word for word if they can, what was promised that day, and whether any of you would be willing to say so before a circuit judge in Del Norte inside 3 weeks' time." Tovey's dark eyes rested on her for a long moment before he answered, and when Trujillo translated his reply, something in Hester's chest eased for the first time in days. "He says he remembers every word of that promise, because a man does not forget the shape of the only kindness given to him amid so much taking. He says he will come himself, with Trujillo to speak for him honestly, if the male writer Joel McCrae will vouch that this court means to hear him as a man, and not merely as a curiosity. He says Joel McCrae has never once in 6 years failed to bring word or payment when he swore he would, and that this is a rarer thing among white men than they seem to know, and that on the strength of that alone, he is willing to ride 3 counties to speak the truth. Joel's throat worked visibly before he answered. Tell him I am honored, and that I will not let his trust go unanswered. They stayed that night at the camp, given a lodge near the fire, and it was there, sitting apart from the others in the cold clean dark with the river murmuring below and frost forming already on the canvas, though the fire still crackled warm nearby, that Joel finally asked her the question she had felt building in him since the ambush on the hillside. Why did you truly ride out after me, Hester? The bounty money, yes, I believe that part. But there is more sitting behind your eyes than $200, and I have watched you long enough now to know it. She considered lying, and found she did not want to. I think, she said slowly, that I have spent a year fighting you over 40 acres of hillside because it was easier than admitting I did not know how to be near you without armoring myself first. My father used to say I inherited his stubbornness and none of his patience. I think some part of me wanted an excuse to ride after you the moment I heard your name in trouble, and dressed that one up as duty and money, because those felt like reasons I was allowed to have. Joel was quiet a long moment watching the fire. I have thought about you more than I ever let on, arguing that spring line, he admitted. I told myself it was only that you were the most stubborn woman I had ever met, and I could not abide losing an argument to you. I am beginning to think that was also a want dressed up as something safer to admit. That is a very roundabout way of saying something, Joel McCrae. I am a male writer, not a poet. A faint smile touched his mouth, the first easy one she had seen from him since the whole ordeal began. But I will say it plainly, if you would rather. I have not slept a full night in 3, and some part of that is fear of a rope, and a greater part of it tonight is the plain fact of you sitting 3 feet away from me looking like something I did not know I was allowed to want. She reached across the small space between them and took his hand, and this time neither of them let go for a long while, the cold night settling around them and the fire burning low, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight as a fist since the day Bell's men burst into the land office finally, quietly, began to loosen. They left the camp before dawn with Tovey and Trujillo riding alongside them, 4 horses now instead of 2, and a sworn statement from the chief written out in Trujillo's careful hand and signed with Tovey's own mark, describing word for word what had been promised at that council fire 3 years past. It was proof, real proof, the kind courthouse records could not simply ignore, and Hester felt the shape of vindication finally within reach. That reach nearly cost them everything 2 days later, on the steep freight grade above the mining camp at Summitville, where the road wound down through a narrow defile toward a scatter of cabins and a stamp mill where perhaps 30 men worked the afternoon shift, unaware of anything bearing down on them from above. They had stopped to water the horses at a freight company's way station partway down the grade, a rough shed and corral tended by a single teamster who had left his loaded ore wagon standing on the grade above with its brakes set, while he helped his hired man with a balking mule team. It was there that 2 of Bell's remaining riders found them, having tracked their trail relentlessly through the intervening days, and in the scramble that followed, one of the men, more desperate than clever, put a rifle ball through the brake block of the standing freight wagon, rather than risk a clean shot at Joel across open ground. The wagon lurched, groaned, and began to roll. It was loaded heavy with ore bound for the stamp mill below, iron-bound wheels gathering speed with terrible swiftness down the steep grade, and directly in its path, a quarter-mile downhill, the mill crew worked in the open yard around the ore chute, entirely unaware of the death bearing down on them. The mill! Hester shouted, and did not wait to see if Joel had heard her before she was already spurring the roan down the grade parallel to the runaway wagon's track, her mind working faster than her fear. Joel was already moving too, angling his gelding onto the road itself just ahead of the wagon's gathering speed, and Hester understood in an instant, with a clarity born of shared danger and a growing trust in exactly what this man was capable of, what he meant to attempt. The chain, he shouted back to her, pointing to a heavy drag chain coiled at the rear of the wagon bed, meant for exactly this kind of emergency on steep grades, dangling now loose and swinging as the wheels picked up speed. If we can hook it to that boulder at the bend, it might hold long enough to slow her. There was no time to argue the wisdom of it. Hester drove the roan alongside the wagon's near wheel, matching its terrible speed on the narrow track with a boulder wall on one side and open air on the other, and leaned far out of the saddle to catch the swinging end of the drag chain, her fingers closing on cold iron just as the wagon hit a rut and bucked hard enough to nearly throw her from the saddle entirely. She held on. Joel had already reached the bend ahead, dismounted in one fluid motion, and was working frantically to loop a second chain, kept coiled at the way station for exactly such use, around the base of a great granite boulder embedded solid at the road's edge. Now, Hester, throw it now. She flung the chain's free end toward him with every bit of strength in her arm, and he caught it, wrapped it twice around the boulder's anchor point, and threw his whole weight against the linkage pin to set it fast, all in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, while the wagon bore down on the bend at a speed that would have crushed him where he stood had the chain failed to catch. It caught. The wagon's frame screamed as the chain went taut, wheels locking, the whole heavy mass slewing sideways with a violence that snapped one wheel clean off its axle and sent ore spilling across the road in a thundering cascade. But it held, it stopped, 40 yards short of the mill yard where the crew had finally looked up at the commotion, and scattered in shouting confusion, none of them harmed, none of them ever knowing quite how close death had rolled toward them down that mountain grade. Hester swung down from the roan on legs that would barely hold her, and Joel was there in the same instant, both of them breathing hard, and neither of them said a single word before he pulled her against him and she let him, her face pressed to his shoulder, both of their hearts slamming, and for a long moment the whole wrecked wagon and spilled ore and shouting mill crew fell away into something distant and unimportant beside the simple fact that they had both survived it together, because of each other. "You are entirely reckless," he said finally into her hair, his voice rough. "You caught a moving drag chain from horseback like it was nothing at all. You anchored a runaway ore wagon to a boulder with 4 seconds to spare," she said back, muffled against his shirt. "I do not believe either one of us has any standing to call the other reckless." He pulled back just far enough to look at her, and whatever careful distance either of them had tried to maintain finally gave way entirely. He kissed her there on the mountain road with ore dust still settling around them, and the mill crew's shouts finally quieting below. Kissed her slow and certain, like a man who had ridden a great many miles to arrive somewhere he had not known he was heading, and she kissed him back with both hands fisted in the front of his shirt, holding on the way she had held that chain, with everything in her. The 2 riders who had shot the break block were found an hour later, having fled at the sight of the wreck they had caused, run down by the outraged mill crew and the way station teamster, and turned over, bound hand and foot, to the constable at Summitville, with a full account of Cyrus Bell's orders written into the record by a magistrate's clerk before the sun set that evening. It was one more page for the courthouse ledger, one more piece of a truth that was growing too large and too well witnessed for Garrett Voss to bury. They rode into Del Norte 4 days later. On the morning Judge Perkins Wardell was due to open his circuit session, with Tovey and Trujillo beside them, the sworn statement in Hester's saddlebag, alongside a deposition from Adeline Innes and a written account from the Summitville magistrate. And Joel McCrae rode in with his head up and no attempt at concealment at all. Because Hester had told him plainly the night before that a man did not walk into a courthouse looking guilty if he meant to be believed innocent. Word of their approach had run ahead of them, as word does in a small county seat, and by the time they reached the courthouse square a crowd had gathered, curious and uncertain, and among them stood Cyrus Bell, and behind him, mounted on a fine bay gelding with a look of controlled fury on his heavy face, Garrett Voss himself. "That is the wanted man riding in bold as brass," Bell called out, already reaching for his rifle. "I claim that bounty right here and now." "You will do no such thing," Sheriff Reyes said, stepping down from the courthouse porch with his own hand resting on his pistol. And beside him, to Hester's fierce relief, stood Abel Whitlock, his head still bandaged from the blow Bell had given him, but very much alive and very much willing to speak. "Joel McCrae rides in under the protection of a deputized officer of this county, and any man who raises a weapon against him on these courthouse grounds will answer to me directly." "On what grounds?" Voss demanded, his voice carrying easy authority across the square, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "Does a common outlaw ride into my county seat under protection?" "On the grounds," Hester said, swinging down from the roan and drawing herself up to her full height in front of him, her voice ringing clear across the square, "that Joel McCrae was standing inside Abel Whitlock's land office at 15 minutes past 2 on the afternoon Sam Petty died. A fact I can swear to under oath, having signed the very same ledger 5 minutes behind him, a page that was torn from the county's own book by Cyrus Bell's hand not 3 hours later, in front of witnesses. In an attempt to destroy the one record that would clear him." A murmur ran through the crowd. Whitlock stepped forward, his voice unsteady but clear. "It is true. I have said as much to the sheriff already. Bell struck me down and took that page himself. And on the grounds," Joel added, dismounting to stand beside Hester, "that the agreement filed at this courthouse regarding the North Fork grazing right does not match the words spoken and sworn to by Chief Tovey's counsel 3 years past. A falsehood, I believe, was arranged by Mr. Voss and his interpreter to clear that land for a railroad survey, and one Sam Petty may have died to keep buried." Voss's composure did not crack entirely, but something in his face went very still. "These are wild accusations from a wanted fugitive and a woman chasing a bounty." "Then let the judge decide it," Hester said. "That is what courthouses are for, Mr. Voss, whatever you have been hoping to avoid by keeping this settled with rifles instead of records." Judge Wardell, a spare, sharp-eyed man who had ridden circuit through these mountains for 11 years and had little patience left for theater, opened his session an hour later in the crowded courthouse with every principal party present, and it was there, over the course of that long afternoon, that the truth finally laid itself out plainly on the record for anyone with eyes to read. Abel Whitlock testified to the torn ledger page and the assault upon his person. The Summitville magistrate's written deposition, read aloud into the record, described the confession of the 2 riders who had sabotaged the ore wagon under Bell's direct orders to eliminate McCrae and the woman traveling with him. Adeline Inn's sworn statement described Joel's warning about the falsified agreement, given days before the murder. And Chief Tovey, through Trujillo's careful translation, gave an account of the original council agreement so detailed and so consistent with the terms Joel had described that Judge Wardell ordered the original filed courthouse copy, brought forward and compared line by line. The discrepancy once laid bare was damning. A single altered clause, inserted after the council's agreement but before the county filing, changing safe passage into forfeiture, in handwriting that a clerk under Judge Wardell's own order identified, after careful comparison, as belonging to Ezra Calloway, the missing interpreter. "And where," Judge Wardell asked the courtroom, "is Mr. Calloway now, that he might answer for this discrepancy himself?" It was Sheriff Reyes who answered, having received a wire only that morning from a deputy in Canijos County. Calloway's body had been found 2 days past in a ravine off the Alamosa Road, dead of a gunshot wound, in circumstances the local coroner had already ruled suspicious. The courtroom went very quiet at that. Garrett Voss, seated near the back with Bell beside him, had gone pale beneath his weathered color, and when Judge Wardell called his name to answer for the ledger theft, the assault on Whitlock, and his connection to the falsified agreement, he rose with the careful dignity of a man calculating his odds, and found, in the silence of that courtroom full of witnesses and sworn statements, that his odds had run out entirely. He was placed under arrest before the session closed that afternoon, along with Cyrus Bell, on charges the county attorney assured the court would be thoroughly investigated, including the murder of Sam Petty and quite possibly the murder of Ezra Calloway as well. Judge Wardell formally cleared Joel McCrae's name on the record, ordered the falsified clause in the courthouse copy struck, and the original agreement terms restored to protect the Ute Council's grazing rights along the North Fork, and thanked, in words Hester would remember for the rest of her life, the deputy tracker whose diligence and integrity had brought the truth to light across 3 counties. It was over. She stood on the courthouse steps afterward in the late afternoon light, the cold already beginning to creep back into the air as the sun dropped toward the western ridge, and felt the enormous weight of the past 2 weeks lift off her shoulders all at once, leaving her strangely light-headed and near to tears in a way that had nothing to do with sorrow. Joel found her there. "It is done," he said, wonderingly, as though he had not quite let himself believe it would truly happen until this moment. "I am not a wanted man anymore." "No," she agreed. "You are simply a male rider with a very good horse, and I am given to understand $250 in reward money now owed to you from the county for information leading to the arrest of Garrett Voss on the charge of ledger theft and assault, which the county attorney tells me is separate from the bounty that was rightly voided the moment your innocence was established." "I do not want that money for myself," Joel said, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. "I have been thinking on this the whole ride down from Summitville, Hester. Your note comes due at Colby's bank inside 2 weeks now, does it not?" "It does." "Then let the reward go to you, and let it clear that debt, and let me sign over my claim to the spring parcel besides, the whole 40 acres, so there is no more contest between us over water rights ever again. You fought a year to protect what your father wanted for that land, and I have spent 3 years holding a claim I filed mostly out of stubbornness, and never once had the settled life to properly use. It should be yours outright, free and clear, and the money besides. I would rather see your father's ranch safe than see my own name on one more piece of paper." Hester stared at him and felt something fierce and tender rise up in her chest all at once. "No," she said. He blinked. "No, you are not going to sacrifice the only home you have ever tried to build for yourself, Joel McCrae, not for me. Not after everything I have watched you refuse to give up on this whole road, that spring included. You told me yourself you filed that claim because you were tired of never having a fire that was truly yours. I am not going to let you hand that away the very week you have finally been given back your good name, out of some notion that you owe me a debt you do not owe. Hester, I mean it. If you sign that parcel over to me alone, I will simply file a fresh contest against my own claim the very next morning, and we will be right back where we started, arguing in front of poor Abel Whitlock, and I do not believe either of our nerves can bear that a second time." A slow, helpless smile broke across his face. "Then what would you have me do instead?" "File it jointly," she said, her heart hammering now harder than it had at any point on that whole dangerous road, harder even than the moment she had caught that swinging chain. "As mine, and as yours together, in both our names on the same page of the same book, the way we ought to have filed it from the very first day instead of fighting over it like 2 fools. I do not want your sacrifice, Joel. I want your partnership. I have wanted it, I think, for longer than I let myself admit, and I am done pretending 40 acres of hillside pasture was ever really what we were fighting about." He closed the distance between them and took her face in both his hands, careful and sure, the same steady hands that had anchored a runaway wagon to solid stone with 4 seconds to spare. "Hester Graves," he said, "I have ridden a lonely road for a great many years, always useful to everyone and never quite belonging anywhere in particular. I did not know, until you rode into that dry wash with a rifle across your saddle bow and a look on your face like you meant to save my life whether I wanted saving or not, how much I had been waiting for exactly that. I would be glad, more glad than I know how to properly say, to file that claim jointly with you, and to build more than a line shack on it at last, if you would have me." "I would have you," she said, and did not manage to say anything more clever than that, because he was kissing her again, there on the courthouse steps in front of half the town, and she found she did not mind an audience nearly as much as she might once have supposed. They were married 3 weeks later, in the last true chill of that uncertain season, on a morning warm enough at last that the frost did not return by evening, in a small ceremony at the Del Norte Church with Sheriff Reyes standing as witness on Joel's side and Adeline Inn's, who had ridden 2 full days to attend, standing as witness on Hester's. Chief Tovey sent word by Trujillo that he could not travel so far so soon, but wished them a long and abundant life together, and sent, as a wedding gift, a finely worked blanket that Hester kept, ever after, folded across the foot of their bed. Garrett Voss stood trial the following autumn, and was convicted of Sam Petty's murder on evidence that had grown, by then, into an unbreakable chain of testimony reaching from the Turkey Creek grade to the Pedra River camp to the ravine off the Alamosa Road. And Cyrus Bell testified against him in the end, to save his own neck, which satisfied no one entirely, but closed the matter for good before the county's own courthouse record, exactly where Hester had always believed the truth belonged. Joel kept riding the mail route 2 seasons more, because a man does not entirely stop being useful just because he has found somewhere to belong. But he built, that first summer, a proper house of squared timber above the spring on the joint claim, with a wide porch facing west toward the mountains. And Hester built alongside him a home in every sense that mattered, keeping her father's cattle grazing free and easy on land no longer fenced against a single neighbor. The spring running clear, and shared exactly as her father had always believed it should. On the evenings Joel rode in late from the Pagosa route, tired and dust-covered, he would find the porch lamp lit and Hester waiting on the step with coffee already poured, and she would ask him, every time, whether the road had treated him honestly that day, and he would always answer that it had because he had learned, riding beside her across 3 counties in the coldest, most uncertain turn of that year, that the surest way to know a road was honest was to have someone waiting at the end of it who loved you enough to have ridden every mile of it herself.